It was made of wood, it carried no guns, and it flew over Berlin in broad daylight, because it was extraordinarily hard to catch. Saturday morning, January 30th, 1943. Berlin is freezing, and Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring stands inside the Air Ministry building on Wilhelmstraße, preparing to address the nation. Radio engineers at the Haus des Rundfunks are wired and waiting. The broadcast goes live at 11 o'clock. Across the Third Reich, millions of listeners are tuned in to hear Göring celebrate the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. 500 miles to the west, de Havilland Mosquito B.IV bombers from No. 105 Squadron are already in the air, heading east. No turrets, no gunners. Just a pilot, a navigator, and 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines producing roughly 1,460 horsepower apiece. They skim low over the sea, then climb to bombing height as they approach Berlin. At 11 o'clock sharp, exactly on schedule, air raid sirens begin screaming across the capital. The raid disrupted Berlin broadcasting and delayed Göring's speech in the Air Ministry building by 63 minutes. But the RAF wasn't done. Berlin was hit again that same day. One aircraft didn't come back. DZ-367 was lost on the daylight raid against Berlin on January 30th, 1943. The physical damage from both raids was slight. The value was never explosive. It was psychological. The RAF had sent wooden mosquitoes, without defensive guns, to bomb the capital of the Third Reich in broad daylight, and most of them came home. To understand why January 30th mattered, you need to understand what daylight over Berlin normally looked like for everyone else in Bomber Command. Berlin was the most feared target in the RAF. Between November 1943 and March 1944, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris launched what became known as the Battle of Berlin. 16 massed night attacks on the capital using hundreds of heavy bombers per raid. Harris could put roughly 800 serviceable Lancasters and Halifaxes into the air on a given night, equipped with H-2S radar and Pathfinder target marking. He believed it would end the war. "It will cost us between 400 and 500 aircraft," he told the Air Ministry. "It will cost Germany the war." He was half right. The campaign cost Bomber Command 1,047 bombers, with 1,682 aircraft damaged or written off, and more than 7,000 aircrew lost, about 5.1% of the sorties flown. And all of that was at night, with hundreds of aircraft flying in concentrated streams specifically designed to overwhelm the defences. Berlin was ringed with flak batteries, searchlights, and radar-directed fighter control zones. The Luftwaffe deployed the Kammhuber line of ground-controlled interception and later tame bore tactics that funneled growing numbers of night fighters directly into the bomber stream. Daylight over the German capital in a conventional bomber wasn't just dangerous, it was functionally impossible. A formation of Lancasters cruising at 180 miles per hour in daylight over Berlin would have been target practice. The Mosquito did it with a tiny force, then kept doing it again and again for the rest of the war. The idea for an unarmed speed bomber started with Geoffrey de Havilland. By the mid-1930s, his company had built a reputation for fast, aerodynamically clean aircraft, the DH-88 Comet Racer and the DH-91 Albatross airliner, both of which used composite wood construction. The 22-passenger Albatross cruised at 210 miles per hour, outrunning every competitor, and de Havilland noticed that its wooden monocoque structure didn't just save weight, it compensated for lower-powered engines and simplified production at the same time. In July 1938, he wrote to Air Marshal Wilfred Freeman, the Air Council's member for research and development, arguing that wartime shortages of aluminum and steel would be severe, but supplies of wood were adequate. On October 4, 1938, de Havilland presented the Air Ministry with a design for a small, twin-engine bomber made almost entirely of wood, crewed by a pilot and navigator sitting side by side, carrying no defensive armament. The aircraft's protection would be speed alone, so fast that enemy fighters couldn't bring it to combat. The Air Ministry showed little interest. At a meeting in early October 1938, officials asked de Havilland to build wings for other people's bombers as a subcontractor instead. The prevailing doctrine demanded that bombers bristle with turrets, nose turrets, mid-upper turrets, tail turrets, manned by dedicated gunners. An unarmed bomber contradicted everything the RAF believed about survivability. A two-man crew on long missions struck them as insufficient. They wanted at least a third man, plus remotely controlled guns, plus a minimum speed of just 275 miles per hour. Nowhere near the performance de Havilland was proposing. De Havilland didn't stop. On September 20, 1939, 3 weeks into the war, he wrote again to Freeman, arguing that a twin-engine bomber with outstanding performance would need little defensive equipment. Freeman saw the logic and became the project's most powerful advocate in Whitehall, defending it against skepticism from politicians and bomber commanders alike. On 1 January 1940, he chaired a meeting at which de Havilland argued that the DH-98 would be the fastest bomber in the world and therefore useful. Freeman ordered a single prototype to specification B.1/40, a light bomber capable of 400 miles per hour at 24,000 feet, powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. The project nearly died repeatedly. After Dunkirk, Beaverbrook ordered all production concentrated on 5 existing types: Spitfires, Hurricanes, Wellingtons, Whitleys and Blenheims. Freeman effectively ignored the order. Materials were denied. The prototype was only reinstated as a priority in July 1940, after de Havilland's general manager promised Beaverbrook 50 Mosquitoes by December 1941, and guaranteed production wouldn't interfere with Tiger Moth trainers or Merlin engine manufacturing. The design team worked in secrecy at Salisbury Hall, a 17th-century manor house 5 miles from Hatfield, with a hangar disguised as a barn. The prototype, painted overall yellow, was rolled out on November 19, 1940. 6 days later, on November 25th, de Havilland's eldest son, Chief Test Pilot Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. and engineer John Walker, took it into the air from Hatfield for the first time. What they found exceeded even the elder de Havilland's predictions. The Air Ministry had expected the DH-98 to be roughly 20 miles per hour faster than a Spitfire. When the RAF tested it against a contemporary Mark V Spitfire in 1941, the results shocked everyone. At no altitude could the Spitfire stay with the Mosquito. John Cunningham, one of the first pilots to fly the prototype, later recalled that it far outperformed the Beaufighter, then the RAF's frontline night fighter, and that it was a joy to fly. In initial testing, the prototype reached 392 miles per hour at 22,000 feet. With 2-stage superchargers installed later, the same airframe hit 437 miles per hour at 29,200 feet. Production bomber and photo reconnaissance variants routinely exceeded 400 miles per hour in level flight, with later marks like the PR Mark 16 reaching 415 miles per hour. The Military Aviation Museum records the type as capable of reaching speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour while carrying up to 4,000 pounds of bombs. The source of that speed wasn't any single design trick. Every decision de Havilland made fed the same equation. Start with the fuselage. It was built as two half-shells, each a sandwich of thin birch or spruce plywood on the outside, Ecuadorian balsa wood in the middle, about 4/10 of an inch thick, and more plywood on the inside, pressed over concrete molds and bonded with casein glue. The two halves were joined along the center line. No rivets, no metal seams breaking the skin. The result was an airframe that was both extremely light for its size and aerodynamically smooth. No rivet heads or panel joints creating parasitic drag, just a sleek, unbroken surface slipping through the air. Wooden construction also solved a manufacturing bottleneck. Britain's aluminium and steel were desperately needed for Spitfires, Lancasters and tanks. The Mosquito could be built in furniture factories by woodworkers whose peacetime jobs involved making beds and cabinets. Wartime newsreels made exactly that point. De Havilland set up 4 production lines, and at peak output, 1 complete aircraft rolled off each line every day. The wood itself changed over the war. Fuselage skins originally used birch and balsa, later shifting to birch and spruce when balsa became difficult to source in sufficient quantities. Some popular accounts claim wood made the Mosquito invisible to radar. One pilot told the Imperial War Museum, "Being wood, their radar detection didn't find us very easily because there was no reflection back from it." But this overstates the case considerably. Wood has some radar transparent properties, but the Mosquito still carried 2 metal engines, propellers, landing gear, and avionics equipment that reflected radar energy. The aircraft's real advantage against interception was speed and timing, not material stealth in the modern sense. Now, bolt 2 Merlin engines onto that lightweight airframe. Early bomber marks used the Merlin 21, producing around 1,460 horsepower per engine at 10,000 feet. Later variants, the B9, B16 and PR marks that flew the deep penetration missions over Germany, fitted 2-stage supercharged Merlins in the 72, 73, 76 and 77 series, each generating roughly 1,710 horsepower. Combined output on these late-war marks exceeded 3,400 horsepower, pushing an aircraft that weighed barely 14,300 pounds empty. By comparison, an Avro Lancaster weighed over 36,000 pounds empty and needed 4 Merlins to shift it. The bomb load comparison is equally striking. A B-17 Flying Fortress cruised at roughly 180 miles per hour, carrying its bomb load, crewed by 9 or 10 men, bristling with heavy machine guns. A late-mark Mosquito B-16, with its enlarged bomb bay, could deliver the same 4,000-pound Cookie Blast bomb to Berlin at more than twice the speed, with a crew of 2 and 0 defensive guns. The decision to strip those guns sounds reckless until you follow the engineering through. A typical bomber turret of the era added enormous weight. Between the turret structure, traversing mechanism, ammunition, and the guns themselves, a single installation ran to several hundred pounds, and a heavy bomber like the Lancaster carried 3. Add the weight of the 3 or 4 extra crew members needed to man them, their oxygen, their heated flying suits, their food, their parachutes, and the structural reinforcement required to mount turrets on the airframe. The total penalty ran to thousands of pounds before a single round was fired. Turrets also created massive aerodynamic drag. They were blunt, protruding structures that broke the bomber's streamlined profile, forcing the engines to work harder just to maintain cruising speed. Every turret made the aircraft slower. Every gun meant more weight. Every extra crewman meant a bigger fuselage, which meant more drag, which meant less speed. The Mosquito deleted all of it. No turrets meant no gunners, meant no ammunition feeds, meant a smaller fuselage, meant less drag, meant more speed. De Havilland had designed a virtuous circle. Removing defensive systems made the aircraft faster, and the increased speed became the defense those systems were supposed to provide. Did the doctrine hold up in practice? Post-war analysis suggested that bomber defensive guns were far less effective than wartime doctrine assumed. Hitting a fighter closing at combined speeds of 400 miles per hour or more from a vibrating turret platform was extraordinarily difficult, and gunner kill claims were dramatically inflated. Meanwhile, the weight and drag penalty those turrets imposed measurably reduced the bomber's speed, making interception easier, not harder. The Mosquito didn't try to shoot back. It denied the enemy a viable firing window. German fighter pilots faced a genuine geometry problem when trying to intercept one. Intercepting any aircraft requires a chain of events: early detection, scramble, climb to altitude, vectoring onto the target's flight path, achieving favorable approach geometry, closing to firing range, and holding position long enough to shoot. The Mosquito broke that chain at almost every link. It was small, far smaller than a Lancaster formation, making visual acquisition harder. It flew fast enough that by the time ground controllers registered a track, scrambled fighters, and directed them to the right heading and altitude, the Mosquito was frequently past the interception point already. Even when a fighter managed to close the distance, the engagement window, those few seconds within effective firing range, was vanishingly short against a target moving at over 400 miles per hour. And unlike a heavy bomber, a Mosquito could maneuver, dive, and accelerate away. On paper, some late-model German fighters could match the Mosquito's speed at certain altitudes. The FW-190 was dangerous at medium altitude, and RAF veterans later made clear that if an interception did happen, the danger was real. But reaching the Mosquito's preferred operating altitude above 25,000 feet cost time and fuel that most interceptors didn't have. Dedicated Luftwaffe night fighter groups spent most of the war flying the Bf-110 and Ju-88, both significantly slower. Germany tried to develop faster interceptors, the Heinkel HE-219 and Junkers Ju-388, but neither reached large-scale production. Only the jet-powered Me-262 could reliably overmatch a late-mark Mosquito, and it arrived in tiny numbers, too late to change the equation. In July 1944, a PR Mark 16 from number 544 Squadron was intercepted near Munich by an Me-262 that made 6 passes. The Mosquito crew escaped into cloud and landed safely in Italy. The Mosquito wasn't literally impossible to shoot down. DZ-367 proved that over Berlin, lost not to fighters but to flak. Early low-level daylight attack operations in 1942 and early 1943 carried a high loss risk, as the aircraft were exposed to ground fire at the altitudes where wood and speed offered the least protection. The type's vulnerability at low altitude and medium speed was real, but as tactics matured, higher altitudes, faster transit speeds, precision timing, Mosquito bomber and photo reconnaissance variants appear to have suffered markedly lower loss rates than RAF heavy bombers, though mission profiles differed. A fair comparison requires acknowledging that Mosquitoes flew different mission profiles: smaller formations, faster transits, higher altitudes, and often nuisance raids rather than massed area bombing streams. Comparing a Mosquito sprinting across Berlin at 25,000 feet and 400 miles per hour to a Lancaster grinding through a concentrated flak corridor at 180 isn't perfectly equivalent. But even with that caveat, the survivability gap was enormous. That mattered because the Mosquito kept going back. By mid-1943, Mosquito bomber squadrons within No. 8 Group were flying regular high-speed raids on Berlin. The expanding light night striking force used Mosquitoes to mark targets with pyrotechnic flares for the heavy bomber formations, and to conduct relentless nuisance raids that denied German air defences any rest. When the B-16 variant entered service in February 1944, carrying the 4,000-pound Cookie, the light night striking force became a devastating weapon in its own right. No. 139 Squadron flew 36 consecutive night attacks on the German capital between February and March 1945, carrying those massive bombs each time. Germany never produced an exact Mosquito equivalent. The combination of lightweight wooden construction, powerful Merlin engines, and the industrial capacity to build both at scale proved extremely hard to match inside the Reich. By war's end, 7,781 Mosquitoes had been built across Britain, Canada, and Australia. They flew as bombers, fighters, night fighters, maritime strike aircraft, pathfinders, photo reconnaissance platforms, and civilian transports through enemy airspace. In the final weeks of the European War, Mosquitoes bombed Berlin on 36 consecutive nights, ending on April 20th to 21st, 1945. The last RAF bombs to fall on the capital before Soviet troops entered the city. Every other bomber of its generation tried to survive by carrying more. More guns, more armour, more crew. Heavier turrets, thicker plate, extra gunners scanning for threats. The logic was intuitive. If enemies are shooting at you, bring enough firepower to shoot back. Geoffrey de Havilland looked at that same problem and stripped everything away. He cut the crew to 2. He built the airframe from plywood that furniture makers could shape. He deleted every gun, every turret, every ounce of defensive weight. And then he bolted on 2 of the best piston engines ever built and pointed the result at Berlin in broad daylight. The Mosquito's invisibility was never stealth. It was time. By the time German radar controllers plotted a track, the Mosquito was already somewhere else. By the time fighters reached altitude, it was heading home. By the time Berlin reacted, another wave had crossed the city and disappeared. 2 men in a plywood cockpit doing 400 miles an hour over the most heavily defended city in Europe, and often safer in practice than 10 men in a metal fortress. Subscribe for more stories like this.